An original podcast from podlatino.com.
Asking someone to verify a piece of information before sending it doesn't produce the same effect as telling them not to make the same mistake they made last week. Both messages can refer to exactly the same situation, same context, same person, same expected action. But one activates attention and the other activates defensiveness. The difference isn't in the facts, it's in how they were framed. And that difference changes what the other person feels, what they understand, and what they do next. This happens all the time, and we almost never notice it. We talk, we listen, we respond. And throughout that exchange, we're constantly making judgments about whether something seems reasonable, threatening, urgent, or unnecessary. Many of those judgments don't depend solely on what was said, but on how it was said. Language isn't just a vehicle that moves information from one mind to another. It's also the environment in which that information appears. And that environment shapes what the information actually means to the person receiving it. Psychology has been documenting this for decades. One of the most well-known experiments was conducted in the mid-70s by researcher Elizabeth Loftus. In that study, two groups of people watched the same video of a car accident. One group was asked how fast the vehicles were going when they hit each other. The other group was asked the same question with a different verb. They were asked how fast the cars were going when they smashed into each other. The event was identical, but the group that received the more violent verb estimated a higher speed, and a week later they remembered seeing broken glass at the scene, even though there was none in the video. A single word altered the perception of the event and changed the memory of something that never happened. What happens in situations like that isn't manipulation in the dramatic sense of the word. It's something more basic. Language never arrives in the mind as a blank slate. Every word activates a network of associations, images, and emotions that were already there, built from the listener's prior experience. When someone says problem, the mind goes somewhere different than when they say challenge. When something is described as uncommon instead of rare, the listener processes it differently. When someone talks about a price adjustment instead of a price increase, the emotional effect changes, even though the fact is identical. The verbal packaging steers interpretation before conscious reasoning even has a chance to step in. This is what cognitive psychology calls framing. It doesn't involve lying about reality or hiding information. It involves choosing which angle to present that reality from. And that choice has real consequences for how the listener interprets the situation, how they feel about it, and what they're willing to do. Framing doesn't force a conclusion directly. It suggests one. It makes one feel natural. And that suggestion is often enough to tip a decision without the person realizing they were influenced at all. An example that comes up frequently involves how medical options are presented. When a patient is told that a procedure has a 90% survival rate, they tend to be more willing to accept it than when they're told the same procedure has a 10% mortality rate. The information is mathematically identical, but the first framing activates a perspective of gain, and the second activates a perspective of loss. The mind responds differently to those two perspectives, even though the numbers are exactly the same. Not because people are irrational, but because emotional processing is faster than conscious analysis. And framing operates at that earlier level. Tone works in a similar way, though through a different path. Two people can say the exact same sentence and produce completely different effects depending on how it sounds. A warm, unhurried tone creates a sense of safety that opens people up to trust. A rushed or slightly tense tone triggers alertness, even when the content of the message is entirely harmless. The rhythm of the sentences, the pauses, the points of emphasis aren't decorative features of communication. They're part of the message itself. Sometimes they're the part that matters most because they act directly on the listener's emotional state before the content is even processed. This shows up clearly in negotiations, but also in everyday conversations. When someone tells another person, "Don't you think it might be good to take a break?" instead of "You need to stop," you're exhausted, they're choosing a different frame. The first one invites, the second one dictates. The first leaves room for the other person's autonomy. The second closes it down. And that difference matters because the human mind is especially sensitive to feeling pushed. When we sense that someone is steering us toward a conclusion, we resist, even if we actually agree with what they're saying. When we feel like we arrived at a conclusion on our own, we adopt it more readily and hold on to it more firmly. That's where one of the most interesting mechanisms of persuasive language appears. The possibility that the listener feels they're making a fully autonomous decision, even though the words they received had already paved the way toward that decision from the start. This isn't deception in every case. Sometimes it's simply careful communication, attentiveness to the other person, an awareness that certain ways of saying something generate less resistance and more openness. A healthcare professional who explains to someone what they stand to gain from a lifestyle change, rather than focusing only on the risks of not making one, isn't distorting reality. They're choosing the frame that makes it easier for that person to make a decision that's probably good for them. Understanding how language works doesn't belong only to the world of manipulation. It also belongs to the world of care and connection. Language also has the ability to soften or intensify the emotional weight of a fact without changing its objective content. Euphemisms are the clearest expression of that mechanism. When an organization announces that it will be optimizing its operational structure instead of saying it will be cutting staff, it isn't changing what's going to happen. It's changing the emotional texture of how that news arrives for the people who have to receive it. It makes everything sound more technical, more inevitable, more removed from the actual people it involves. Nobody hearing that kind of announcement is fooled about what it means. But the phrasing filters part of the emotional impact before it lands, and that has real effects on how the news gets processed. The opposite works just as powerfully. There are ways of speaking that deliberately amplify the perception of a problem to generate urgency or alarm. When something gets called a crisis instead of a difficulty, when something is described as inevitable or as leaving no room for action, when extreme language is used where nuance could have been, the effect on the listener is more intense. The mind tends to respond with greater activation to what it perceives as an immediate threat. And that activation can be triggered not by the objective severity of the facts, but by the words chosen to present them. Recognizing that doesn't mean every sense of urgency is manufactured. It means language can amplify or reduce the perception of risk independently of how serious that risk actually is. There's also a quieter phenomenon worth naming: repetition. When an idea gets mentioned many times across different contexts, it starts to feel familiar. And what feels familiar tends to feel more true, more reasonable, more acceptable. Not because repetition adds new evidence, but because sustained exposure reduces the friction that unfamiliar things naturally generate. An idea that initially met with resistance can become completely normal over time, not because it was argued more convincingly, but simply because it was named often enough. Recognizing all of this shouldn't lead to a permanent state of suspicion. Not every conversation is a calculated influence operation. People choose words constantly without designing strategies. But speaking always involves influencing, even when that's not the intention. Whoever chooses a verb, a tone, an order of ideas, is constructing a version of the world that the other person will receive. And that version is never completely neutral. What changes when someone starts paying attention to this isn't that they stop trusting what they hear. It's that they begin listening on two levels at once. One is the level of explicit content, what is being said. The other is the level of framing, where it's being said from, in what tone, what gets emphasized, what gets left out. That kind of double listening doesn't make anyone more suspicious. What it does is return a bit of ground to the listener in their own process of interpretation and decision-making. Words don't just describe what's happening. They often build the atmosphere in which something starts to seem inevitable, reasonable, or desirable. Listening well isn't only about hearing the content of a message. It's also about noticing the frame that makes that message feel convincing before the arguments even arrive. And that awareness, once developed, quietly but meaningfully changes how you stand in relation to what you're being told.